You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy network.
Welcome to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast with me, Carl Betts. In this conversation, we will examine where the line is between training and instinct in the time-pressured, high-intensity environment of a military jet pilot's world, to determine if you need them both in equal measure and how situational awareness dovetails into this, whilst also examining some of our guests' first-hand experiences. To do this, I'm really pleased to be able to speak with Paul Heasman, who learned his trade as a fast jet pilot in the RAF as a Tornado pilot, before moving into fast jet pilot instructor training flying Hawk aircraft, whilst also subspecialising in crew resource management and human factors. Paul also played a part in developing and introducing a new variant of the Hawk trainer into service. Paul's current role is for Draken, who facilitate operational readiness training through partner organisations within the military world. So, welcome to the podcast, Paul. And can I say, that's an interesting bio right there. And actually, we could just talk about that bio for the entire podcast, because that's really interesting. But we need to get into what we need to talk about, which is around about the operation, the organisational world of a fast jet pilot. However, we do need to set the scene a little bit. I've given you a bit of a bio, but I'd like to welcome you in. And actually, can you just tell us a bit about your really interesting 20 years in the RAF and flying these amazing fast jets?
Hey, Carl. Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's great to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast. So I joined the Air Force in 1999. I went through training through various different aircraft types, and then I flew the Tornado F3 from RAF Leeming for 3 years before being selected for instructor duties. And I was sent off to RAF Valley on Anglesey, which is pretty windswept. And I spent 11 years there flying the Hawk trainer, initially the Hawk T1. And then I was selected to be part of the team of 6 to bring the T2 aircraft into service. So I did that. In that time, I got interested in human performance. I became an RAF aircrew human performance coach. I was very interested in human factors, did Myers-Briggs type training, and then took that out to the Middle East and went out to Saudi Arabia for 4 years, flying Hawks out there, and became a HF facilitator. And then recently with Draken, I've become a CAA CRM instructor for the business. And I facilitate CRM discussions as part of the kind of aircrew routine training that has to happen every year to keep the CAA happy.
Okay, so the CAA bit's, I'm guessing, the Civil Aviation Authority. That's that side of it, and the CRM bit is the crew resource management side of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It'd be really interesting actually. Just to first up, can you just give us a bit of an explanation about what crew resource management is? Because the term resource, can mean different things to different people. So it would be good to actually get a handle on what that is.
Yeah, it was really interesting getting into that from the civilian world. So crew resource management is effectively making your team better. The sum of the parts is greater than the whole, or whatever that phrase is. And unfortunately, it's a discipline, it's a skill set whose roots are in tragedy. Ultimately, airliners crash, people scratch their heads and think, how did that happen? And in the early days, it was generally mechanical. Okay, as machines get better and better and better, airlines are still crashing. What the heck is going on? Well, actually, it's probably the human in the loop. So the crew are the people on the aircraft. The resources could be that crew, but actually, the crew could encompass people like air traffic control, engineering, op support, things like that. And it's just CRM is a vehicle to explain to people how being a human being who, if there were blueprints for human beings, they would say something like, to be used at 1G sea level during the daytime, and that's it. And then how we take that human being and what happens when we put him or her into an aeroplane at 30,000 feet, with less oxygen potentially at night, pulling G, doing things that the body wasn't designed to do. How does that human work, and how can we get the best out of him or her? So yeah, it's really interesting. It dives off down many different facets, decision making, situational awareness, all sorts of bits and pieces. Really interesting.
And it's really interesting there, Paul, that you talked about. It's not just about the people in the aircraft. it's a bigger system to this, that the engineers, if the engineers aren't on point, then that is going to affect the serviceability of the aircraft, which then affects the pilot to be able to undertake their duties. It's really nice to hear that actually, that sort of without any one of them bits of the team and without any one of them cogs, it'll fall apart. And it's really interesting that.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's not just that without one of those cogs, it'll fall apart. But if one of those cogs isn't working effectively, then similarly, it will fall apart. So my earliest introduction to this concept was actually back in the Air Force as a very junior pilot on the Tornado. I remember hearing an anecdotal story about a Tornado pilot he planned the mission, briefed the mission, was literally about to step to the jet. And as he's stepping for the jet, the supervisor calls him over and goes, "Hey, Bloggs, when you get back, the RF police want to have a word with you about something or other." And obviously this guy's now stepping to the jet going, what the heck is all that about? Okay, and his brain is clearly not on the task of flying a 20-ton aeroplane. But what do the police want to speak to me about? It's probably something minor like a parking infraction or something, but you don't know. And it's, external factors penetrating that mission bubble, can be an absolute killer. And so we try to bring that into CRM in the CAA world, where we don't just speak to the the pilots and the electronic warfare officers in the Falcon, but we try to get people from ops and engineering involved too, just so that they can understand that when the crews are walking out to the jet and they're not happy and smiley and focused, not happy and smiley and interactive, well, there's a reason for that. They're not being rude, it's just that they're mission focused. Little bits and pieces like that.
And that's really interesting from a pre-hospital care point of view, when you've got to be really on point with that particular instant that you're working on, but you've maybe not eaten for 8 or 9 hours, you're on your 6th shift in a row, you've been late off every shift, or there's been lots of things going on with your family life and things like that. It's really interesting to see nowadays in the modern world that actually these factors are really being taken serious. And there is a reason why I'm not on point on that day, and it needs to be understood that there's a genuine reason why I'm not on point on that day. And actually, it may well be the organisation's issue as to why I'm not on point. As such, like that anecdotal story, someone just turned up, "Oh, just by the way, that flippant comment, someone needs to speak to you." Even if it's not the police, even if it's just your supervisor, you naturally go into that feeling of, "Oh, right, what have I done?"
Yeah,
because that's how the human brain sort of functions with these things. So it's really, really interesting. And to be fair, that's going to be what you're talking about there is going to come back into play when we sort of carry on with this podcast. Because I'd really like to sort of, when we talk about the human part of this, what I class as instinct, you might deem as something slightly different. But to me, when we talk about instinct, is I'm on a job. It might be time critical. I just have to work on getting this patient from A to B quickly, safely, well packaged, well treated. But my instinct tells me I've got to do this quick. There's something going on. The situation is telling me this, but I'm just aware that I want to get on with this. And for me and for other pre-hospital clinicians, when we talk about listening to your gut, we do it a lot. And I think we rely on it a lot as part of our safety mechanism. And I'm just really keen to hear about what your thoughts around pilot instinct within the jet, how that works.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The instructor in me is desperate to drill in and start asking you questions, but I'm not going to do that because that's not the focus of this podcast. So what I would say from that is, you're making decisions. You're using instinct, but actually you're making decisions. Okay, words you said like, "I feel I need to get this patient there quickly." Well, that's a decision, because quickly implies there's an increased risk. So you're only doing that for a reason. You've only made that decision for a reason. So when I'll be honest, I tend not to think about instinct. Okay, I tend to think about the different levels that we've got of decision making. And from some of the CRM training that I did a couple of years ago, that I facilitated a couple of years ago, one of the topics was decision making. And the way we teach it is that there are 3 levels of decision making. So at the top level, you've got your kind of rational decision making, where we're going to sit down and we're going to consider the factors and we're going to take our time and we're going to come up with a decision. And that's where you might have heard of things like OODA loops. Have you ever heard of the OODA loop?
Okay. Yeah, some of the listeners might not have, so it might be good to.
No worries. So the OODA loop, designed by a US Air Force Colonel Boyd, who was a MiG killer, a fighter pilot in the Vietnam War, and he recognized that to be able to effectively kill the bad guy, take down the hostile aircraft, there are certain processes that you've got to be able to do. So you must be able to observe the hostile jet. You can't fight what you can't see. You've got to be able to see him, and you've got to not only see him but see what he's doing. Okay, so what sort of maneuvers is he flying? How's he flying his aircraft? So you've got to observe him. You've then got to orientate yourself. So that's the next step, orientate. What that means is that fighter is performing maneuver X, Y, or Z. Okay, my counter to that, or my way to capitalize that, could be one of, a number of actions. Okay, so orientate yourself to the possibilities. You've then got to decide on which one of those possibilities you're going to take based on the positives and the negatives that possibility will bring to your situation. And then you've got to physically do it. You've got to act. So OODA. Okay, and the critical thing about the OODA loop is that it is a loop. Once you get to act, well, then you've done something which is going to affect what the bad guy does. So you then have to observe that and orientate yourself and decide and act. And it is an iterative process. So that's classical decision making. And in kind of modern airliner parlance, they now use a different mnemonic. They use OODA because clearly somebody wanted to write a book, and they, possibly, but it brings in other factors. It brings in factors like time, which are much more relevant to the airline scenario. But the important thing is that it's an iterative process where review or observe again is constantly a part of it. So you're always going around that loop. And it is possible that if you can go around that OODA loop quickly enough, well, that could look like a gut instinct reaction. Okay.
Yeah.
But actually, that's quite a time-consuming way of doing business. So another way of making decisions is to use biases and heuristics, effectively, mental models that we've been programmed with. But the third way of making decisions is called intuitive decision making, or it's called by some people intuitive decision making. And this is possibly what you're thinking about. And in that, from the aviation point of view, and in that situation, all the brain does is it looks at the scenario and says, right, have I seen this before? What worked that time before? So have I seen this before? Yes. What worked previous? Well, we tried X, that didn't work, out. We tried Y, that didn't work, out. We tried Z, that worked, we're doing Z. Okay. Yeah. That can happen incredibly quickly. The problem there is that, well, we only went to Z. What if we've gone back down and went through A, B, C, D, E? There might be an even better one at K. Okay, but we never got to that. All right. So that's a problem. There may be a more efficient solution. Another problem is there's no iteration. Okay, you're just going to go down, find a solution, push, and run with it. And that sort of decision making, because it's so quick, is incredibly dependent on an accurate assessment of what's going on. Okay. Yeah. It's that situational awareness that you talked to before. So if, it's like a computer, garbage in, garbage out. If you incorrectly assess the situation, then actually you're going to come up with the wrong reaction. Okay. It really is as simple as that. So for me, that intuitive decision making could look a lot like instinct. And it's something that human beings have done. I mean, the reason that we still use it in the 21st century is because our ancestors on the Serengeti, it worked for them. The ones who didn't use it probably got eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. So, there is a place for it.
And that's really interesting that you talk about that sort of intuition, as it were, because when you were a fast jet trainer and you were teaching students, I'm really sort of interested to sort of hear how you discuss that with your students to show the importance of it, and to sort of, is it all about the experiences, because you can't make that intuitive decision unless you've got the experiences, or can you make them decisions without the experience? Do the two balance each other out?
So Paul's view is very much that no, you need the training. So And I feel that the Air Force flying training system is geared to that. It's to give as much experiential data to the trainee as possible, so that when he or she comes to the point where they're put in that crunch, must make a decision quickly, they can rapidly sort through all of the all of the things that they've tried in the past and come up with an answer. And the way that the Air Force do that is a lot through training on the ground. So the old adage of train hard, fight easy, well, that's absolutely true. So before a girl gets into one of those things, a Hawk for the first time, they have done many hours in the simulator where they've gone from just learning to start the blooming thing, get the thing airborne and get it back on the ground. And once they can do those basic skills, then maybe when they're starting it one time, well, the engine will burst into flames, and they'll be expected to observe. Okay, I've got the indications of an engine fire. Orientate. What do I do? Well, I follow the checklist, decide to follow the checklist, and then act and follow the checklist. Okay, and you don't have to do that in a £60 million simulator. Okay, you can actually chair fly. Have you ever heard of chair flying?
Yeah,
chair
no,
flying.
but
So literally sit in a chair, eyes closed if you like, and just mentally rehearse. And it's a really powerful, it's so simple and such a powerful way of building experience, because the brain apparently can't tell the difference between actually being involved in an engine fire in the aircraft and shutting it down, or if you do it with enough conscious effort, just being sat in a chair and eyes closed, engine fire, my actions are whatever they were, can't remember, probably something to do with throttle off, a few more things to do with fuel, and then hit the fire extinguisher or something like that. And if you do that sufficiently, then these are just experiences that the brain logs, such that when it happens for real, engine fire, action, and it seems seamless.
Yeah, and I think the really interesting thing with that is when you sort of chair flying and simulator flying and things like that, although the simulators are sort of super realistic in modern day ones, what you haven't got is the additional bandwidth use of the sort of the fear aspect of it, of the I am in this situation and my bum's potentially on fire while this jet's on fire. Do you think that sort of pilots nowadays are so well versed in the processes that need to be followed, and the fear side of it just won't come into play as such, that they're so focused on the task ahead? And I mean, I know you talked about sort of the operational focus, but as a human being, there are things that sort of can creep in. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. What is that old adage? If you think you can do it, you're right. If you think you can't do it, you're also right. So if you allow yourself to fail, you'll fail. There's a reasonably entertaining YouTube video of some crazy Red Bull Air Race pilot flying through a tunnel in a single-engined aeroplane. It's nuts. I mean, there must be a foot of clearance from the wingtip to the tunnel edge, and he's flying through this tunnel. And there is a bit of footage looking at him, and he is laser focused on flying the aircraft accurately. Nothing else is going to impinge, his bubble there. So that focus is massively important. In terms of I've gone massively off track. What was the thrust of your question again?
So I was basically talking about, you've got someone who's chair flying and they're doing that simulation thing, and the brain can't tell the difference between what's right, what's real and what's not real.
Yeah.
But effectively at that point, if you're in a real life situation where your bum is on fire and you might have to pull the ejection handles, then there's that fear side of it, or there's that human side of it, that this is real life, that the simulation in certain ways can't sort of potentially train you to.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, to drill down into the ejection scenario, and I've never ejected, but I've spoken to people who have, and actually once, certainly, one guy in particular I'm thinking about, once he'd made the decision to eject, well, it was the easiest decision. Or once he'd come to the point where he needed to make that decision, well, that's the easiest decision in the world. You pull the handle and off you go, and then mechanics take over. Have you ever seen the movie Sully?
Yeah, I have.
So that's a great study. I mean, there are so many case studies, within that movie, and obviously within what happened in real life with that aircraft landing on the Hudson, that you can pick out all sorts of lessons from there. And it's really interesting that they were shocked. There was that human, what the heck happened for 35 seconds before any actions kicked into place. So there is always going to be that particular human factor. But then the idea of training and, the repetition, the simulator, the chair flying, all that sort of stuff, is that when an incident happens, it's almost like a switch being flicked, and the training takes over, and it would seem almost like you're on autopilot. And looking at the movie Sully, that's actually quite evident. The idea of him taking the jet into the Hudson sounds absolutely bizarre when there are two airports that you could potentially fly to. But I was just watching an interview with him a couple of days ago, and he said how he'd flown into New York so many times that any good pilot would consider options. Okay, and he'd made the decision that there were effectively three places he could land if he had a major malfunction on the aircraft. He could either go back to LaGuardia, he could go to Teterboro, which is in Newark, and or was it New Jersey? Whatever. Or he could put it down on the Hudson. And so he's that process. He's effectively mentally chair flying his options way before the issue happened, such that when it did happen, it was like, right, okay, our options are this. We're going to try to go back to LaGuardia. Okay, that's not going to happen. We're going to speak to our wider resource, our wider crew, the air traffic controller. Hey, what else is there? There's Teterboro. Can we get in there? No, we can't. Okay, well, it's the Hudson then. And that's it. That's a decision.
And that's sort of really interesting, the fact that you've just been talking about he's flown out of that airport multiple times. So he's probably ran through certain scenarios. He might not ran through the exact scenario what went on, because I don't think anybody had ran through that scenario, because I think it was a first for anybody. But like you say, yeah, it's a really interesting concept of that chair flying. And actually, within our world in sort of pre-hospital care, for instance, I wonder how much chair flying we actually do when we reflect on jobs, or when we think about jobs that we're doing. Because there's jobs that I've reflected on, quite a lot, as to did we do everything we could, and was there anything else we could do as a sort of team? And that's obviously a really healthy approach to learning. But that also then allows me to build up my experiential knowledge at that point, to now allow my intuitive process to have a greater, a greater fulfilled volume, really effectively, which some of our newer colleagues, and in your case newer pilots, won't necessarily have, because they haven't had the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a question that I would have asked you. How good was your intuitive decision making, or your intuition or instinct, when you first started your role as opposed to now?
Yeah, and that's really, because I could answer that in terms of my intuitive decision making has gone up, but because I'm not clinical all of the time now, I would say that my intuitiveness is still there, but my skill fade has dropped. So actually, I've got this knowledge, I've got this experience, I've got a lot of things that I can pull on, but my not fear, but my concern now is, because I'm not clinical all the time, is, am I as clinically effective?
Sure.
As I was. And therefore, in terms of the human factor, when I do work on ambulance, or I do work out and about, I now know what I can go to.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm now potentially slightly worried and slightly anxious of the fact that, well, actually, I could go to that, but have I still got the skill set? And am I sort of on point enough to deal with it really, really well?
Yeah.
And that's a really sort of interesting concept, that you start new with not a lot of knowledge, then you gain an awful lot of knowledge, but unless you keep the skill set up behind it, then you've got all the intuition in the world, but actually what lets you down is your ability.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, absolutely. If I was to suddenly be hyperspaced into a Hawk after I last flew a Hawk about four years ago, I could land it. No doubt, I could probably do the majority of the flying with it. The first 20 or 30 minutes wouldn't be pretty, but I certainly wouldn't want an examiner in the back for those first 30 minutes. But yeah, you're exactly right.
But your intuition and your decision making,
yes, it would all still be there.
Yeah, Yeah, might just need a bit of digging around to find it occasionally. So that's sort of really interesting, that around the fact that although the fastjet world is very different to sort of a pre-hospital world, there is some commonalities around it, even with the crew resource management stuff, for instance. And from a pre-hospital world, my fighter jet's potentially an ambulance, and if that ambulance isn't quite on point and isn't handling right, or the bits aren't quite working as well as I should, that's going to impact my ability to therefore do my job. And likewise, if my kit's not on point or there's something missing, then what you need to do, you can't do it. So then you just have to cobble together potentially with what you've got. And it's really interesting to hear, although they're very different worlds, there is some sort of similarities within how we make the decisions. And I'd just be really interested to know, so modern aircraft and your modern office is very, very different to a modern office of 80 years, to an office of 80 years ago in the Second World War. I'm thinking here, Spitfire pilot, different type of aircraft, but at the time that was cutting edge. That was the best. It's the best of the best. They're doing their job. You're in your aircraft doing yours. If you could both be put in exactly the same aircraft now, do you think, although things have changed and lessons have been learned and experience and things, but do you think there is a certain mold of a person needed to be able to do that job? Yes. Is there some qualities needed that haven't changed?
Yeah, without a doubt. It's the ability to generate situational awareness quickly. As you say, the cockpits of the Spitfire and the Typhoon are vastly different. When we brought the Hawk T2 into service, it was basically a Typhoon cockpit squashed into a Hawk, whereas the previous Hawk had very much a Spitfire cockpit with lots of dials and needles and things like that. So we went from being a pilot who had to mechanically fly the aeroplane to a pilot who had to be able to collate and absorb a lot of information and then make decisions based on that. And we coined the phrase information warrior, which was a bit cheesy, but the station commander loved it, and we ran with that. So a Spitfire pilot being hyperspaced into something like a Typhoon would initially be like a dog staring at TVs. What is all of this stuff? But actually, if you've got your head outside the window, flying is still flying. It is a physical process in the physical world, which means it's science. Okay, and if it's science, it can be codified. So the flying will be exactly the same. The way that the information that is fed to that pilot is processed and then acted upon will be very, very different. And it would be entirely unfair to throw a Spitfire pilot into a Typhoon. A better thing to look at would be to throw a Typhoon pilot into a Spitfire, because actually, well, it's an aeroplane, so it flies due to those physical scientific laws that we talked about. And I have no doubt that your average Typhoon pilot, you could throw into any aeroplane and they would fly it, very, very well, very, very quickly, because flying is flying. The whole idea of information warrior versus actually flying and fighting the aircraft is an evolution, and what that means is that certainly the UK Armed Forces, the RAF, and the Royal Navy, who fly fast jets, have had to recruit differently. So the aptitude test that you go through at Officer and Aircrew Selection Centre at RAF Cranwell will be different now, today, than they were 25 years ago when I first did them. Okay, because the ultimate output standard now is a Typhoon or an F-35, which is glass cockpit, modern systems. You are the systems manager of that aircraft. Whereas when I joined, the output standard, rightly or wrongly, was a Tornado or a Jaguar, which was very much a steam-driven cockpit that a Spitfire pilot would have understood reasonably well very, very quickly.
It's really interesting that actually sort of the selection process has to map across to the current situation that the Air Force is working with. I'd never really thought of that, but actually sort of really sort of makes sense. That's like saying, the people who work in the pre-hospital setting doing exactly the same job as somebody from sort of 20 years ago. Well, effectively, they are doing the same job because they're looking after patients, but they're just looking after patients with different kit, with different knowledge, with different settings. But the fundamental thing is, like you said, they're still flying an aeroplane. Yeah. They're just doing it with different systems and sort of different knowledge base, effectively. Now, sort of moving on to that then. So in terms of when you talked about the Tornado pilot who was asked just before he got into an aircraft, look, the military police want to speak to you, or the RAF police, or whoever wants to speak to you. One of the biggest sort of fears, I think, and from talking to a lot of colleagues around working in the pre-hospital setting is you're having to make decisions, and you're sometimes having to make decisions quickly, and you're having to make decisions with the knowledge that you have in the circumstances that you're in. And sometimes, with the best will in the world, them decisions may turn out to be incorrect, not the most appropriate, and therefore questions will be asked. And one of our biggest fears is when someone turns around and says, I need to talk to you about that job. Do you sort of teach your student pilots, or when you were teaching student pilots, sort of a lot of things can go wrong very quickly in the environment that you're in, and obviously it's quite a complex system to be in. There's check cards to go through. You've got obviously a system that you're going to work to when incident X happens. Do you think that there's ever any justification for stepping outside of that, and a pilot working on their own intuition to say, the check cards were saying this, but they then made that decision? If it goes well, I'm not sure questions would be asked. But if it went badly and you bent and pranged a slightly expensive aircraft, then I'm sure questions would be asked. Do you think there's any place for that?
I think, yeah, I do. I absolutely do. Interesting though, if a situation happened and you had to work off script, okay, and it worked, then my hope would be that exactly the same questions that were asked if it didn't go well were asked in the scenario that it did go well. Because actually, if you did something non-standard and it worked, well, we need to know what that was and why you did it, because maybe the processes and procedures that we got in place need to iterate, need to change. So I think that's a really important bit of framing there, that just because something goes well doesn't mean that there aren't lessons to be learned from that. You know, yeah. It should be drilled into every single time. Thinking back to when I was training students, then there is a realization that if something happens, you are going to be, you know, your actions are going to be very much focused on, okay, and questions will be asked as to perhaps why you didn't follow the process and procedure. And that I can't remember it. I can't remember the exact flow off the top of my head. Have you ever heard of the Bain-Simmons FAIR model?
No.
Okay. It's something that I'd have to go away and have a look at. But effectively, what it does is it looks at the flow of an incident, and it assigns blame. Blame maybe isn't the word. Blame is definitely not the word. Okay, we are not a blame culture. Blame is bad because people don't learn from blame. But it assigns a reason for the outcome. So, for example, let me think of a really silly example. Let's imagine I'm flying my Hawk over I don't know, somewhere in Wales, and I know that my family are on holiday at the beach. Okay, so I decide I'm going to go and do a little fly past for them, and I fly past completely legally within what I'm allowed to do with the aircraft. But as I'm flying past, a bird zips past, smashes into the wing, causes a couple of £1,000 worth of damage, and it's all got to be looked at. So the Bain-Simmons FAIR model would take that and go, well, you know, why was I doing what I was doing? Was it for organizational gain? Was it for personal gain? Was it, you know, did I consider the, you know, any potential risks? Was I unnecessarily reckless? And it will filter all these things, and it'll define, you know, he committed an error which might require more training, or he committed a violation, or he was reckless. And you know, that Bain-Simmons FAIR model, you have a look at it. It's a really, really good way of basically drilling down into not only what somebody did, but why they did it. And sometimes a lot of people will do things off script, not for their own gain, but because they think the organisation is going to benefit. And that could be an issue there. Some people are reckless, okay, and that is something that, you know, effectively you're reckless. Well, you're going to get headshot. You're going to be out. Organisational gain can be, you know, mitigated, more training. Errors, mistakes can be mitigated, more training, and things like that. You know, to drill back to your original question though, if the trainee was to do exactly, because their level of experience is so low, because the trainee was to do exactly what the checklist said, and it didn't work out well, then that's a tick. If the trainee was to go off script and it wasn't to work out well, then it would almost be doubly bad, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, and that would speak to failings not only within the trainee's cognitive process, but actually probably within the training system that allowed the trainee the latitude to, you know, to go off script. That in itself is a really big discussion and probably worthy of a podcast in its own right, because there are a lot of things to drill down into there.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can do that one again
Yeah,
later on in the future. But one of the interesting things you've just sort of spoke about within that sort of bit of the discussion is that it's really important that we should be debriefing all the time, and that's one of the things that within our world is because it's such a fast moving sort of pace, and we see so many people and we go to so many instances. To have formal debriefing is really difficult, and therefore there's also the we might not get together and do scenario work as often as we should, etc., because after the scenarios you can then do your debriefings, and the value of debrief is sort of really important for me. And actually I'm assuming that after every mission, after every sortie, after every training session that you deliver, one of the key aspects is the debrief, which you will hold in high regard, I'm guessing.
Definitely, a huge amount of learning happens in the debrief. And I guess I'm probably reasonably old school, kind of central flying school instructor, in that the first question I always ask at the start of the debrief is, how did that go? Tell me what you think about that. And sometimes you'll get quite a long-winded diatribe, and that's fine because you can always pick bits out of it. But it's always worth knowing what the mental model of the trainee was as to what happened. Okay, because if his mental model is everything was fine and dandy and it was a great mission, and your mental model is, well, actually there were these bits that were, you know, utterly rubbish, and we need to work on them, then that starting point, you can't actually have any learning occur until you merge the mental models and you get ourselves on the same page. So
yeah,
how did the trainee think it went? And then, you know, start drilling into bits and pieces from there. Debrief is vital. That question, how did it go, actually should encourage critical reflection within the trainee too. Okay, so that you ask it to them enough that, you know, they should, you know, when they go away and think about things, okay, how did it go? Why did that happen? You know, what can I do differently next time? So I think critical reflection is a really, really important skill for an individual to have in any high pressure environment, to be able to learn from, you know, either things that went well or things that didn't go so well.
And that's again really fascinating, because although it's different worlds, critical reflection is sort of a huge thing in the pre-hospital care world, because it is one of the main ways that you can focus your learning. And I love the fact that you always open with the how do you think it went, because if you do it enough, people feel safe to do it. And I think one of the difficulties is because it's sort of quite not haphazard but ad hoc, and it's not an everyday occurrence. People sometimes, I don't think, feel safe to do it openly and say, well, you know what, I absolutely thought that was a complete I made a dog's dinner of that. And I think that's sort of when you're doing it all the time as business as usual, as standard practice, that we debrief, we debrief, we brief, we debrief, we brief, then it's just accepted normal behaviour, and that is an expectation of how we do our business.
Yeah. One of the things, so for the debrief at work at the moment, as a trainer, one of the things I've changed with the debrief process is the first element when we're discussing, a particular flow or run or something like that, is the first element of that is confessions. Does anybody around the room have any confessions? Okay, and the idea there isn't to throw spears at them, to harangue them, anything like that. It is to encourage that critical thinking and that openness, and almost instill the idea that you're not going to be shot for errors, because errors are the only way we learn. Okay, so it might be that, I forgot to switch something on at such and such a range or something like that. Okay, cool. Why did that happen? Oh, well, I was distracted. All right, cool. So the learning point for everybody is that this distraction, if it happens at this point, can cause that outcome. Brilliant. Okay, and then we move on with the debrief.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating listening to things like that, because I'm sort of going through this in my head and trying to put it all in my world. And sort of, it does just absolutely make sense. That confession question is absolutely sort of brilliant, but that suggests that the culture is really safe for that, which is sort of, and that's the bottom line, is that if people don't feel safe, you're never going to get a true, honest, reflective group debrief, as it were. And sort of that shows a real positive on your part, really, that the team and the organisation has such a culture that you can turn around and say, right, Howie, then tell us what went wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Organisationally, it's fantastic. It's a great culture in that respect. Yeah,
absolutely brilliant. And just to finish off, I always like to finish off with a bit of a pearl of wisdom, just because I think it's really important. But you've got a lot of experience in a lot of fields, doing a lot of stuff. If I was your new trainee, and you're going to offer me a pearl of wisdom about decision making, what would it be?
About decision making, crikey. Take your time. Take as much time as you can. Okay. That might mean that you've only got a split second, if that's as much time, but take as much time as you can. From a training point of view, I would always caution people that the aim is to train harder than we're going to have to fight. So train hard, fight easy. If you can find the day job easy, it's because we trained you hard enough in the training process.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I think we've heard that adage a few times on the podcast, and the fact that it's said quite a lot suggests that it's meaningful for a lot of people.
Yeah,
and the sort of the time thing that you've just talked about is really interesting, because actually, by taking your time to make the decision, you actually gain time in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't have to do things twice because you've rushed things, or you've rushed to a decision that has then got other consequences following that decision. So I think that's a real amazing takeaway point for all of our listeners, and indeed for me personally. So I'm going to draw the podcast to a close now, Paul, but thank you so much for your time with that. It's been really fascinating to talk about the stuff we've been talking about, and more fascinating is the fact that actually there is some tangible links between your world and our world, and just to show that we can learn from different industries, we can learn from different sectors, and it's these discussions between different sectors that actually some of the most poignant learning can sort of take place. So thanks for your time, it's much appreciated, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
My pleasure. No, it's been great. Thank you.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.